So now let's turn to today's topic. There are likely very few of us here who have firsthand experience with seminary formation. So let's begin with some basics. Catholic seminaries are educational institutions where men prepare to be ordained as priests. The formation process usually takes at least 5 years, but can be longer depending on a man's age, background, and the particular program he attends. Typically, seminaries focus on four areas of formation: academic, pastoral, spiritual, and human formation. And candidates will usually earn at least a Master of Divinity degree along the way. It's important to note that there are dozens of Catholic seminaries across the United States, and these seminaries follow norms that are set by the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops and approved by the Vatican Congregation for Clergy. Individual seminaries, while under the supervision of the local bishop, have much freedom in how those norms are implemented. In other words, while seminary leaders do discuss and share best practices, and although they are supervised by the US bishops and the Vatican, the formation process can differ across institutions. Today's discussion will consider the ways that seminaries can be one route to creating a safer and more compassionate church, in part by forming future priests to minister to survivors of sexual abuse who disclose to them. And this is just one of many areas that need attention and reform to address the abuse crisis. So let's turn to our speakers. Today, our panel includes Father Tom Berg, who is joining us from South Bend, Indiana. Father Tom is visiting professor at the McGrath Institute for Church Life at the University of Notre Dame, where he leads the Seminary Renewal Project. He and colleagues wrote a white paper called Fully Equipped for Every Good Work, which outlines 12 benchmarks for seminary formation programs designed to prepare seminarians to offer trauma-informed pastoral care to abuse survivors. He previously spent more than 12 years as a professor of moral theology at St. Joseph's Seminary in New York, where he was also director of seminarian admissions. Father Tom has long been involved with restorative justice practices and is also a member of Awake's board of directors. Thank you for being here today, Father Tom. Next, let's introduce Mary Glowaski. Mary lives in Fort Wayne, Indiana, where she worked for 21 years as the Victim Assistance Coordinator in the Diocese of Fort Wayne, South Bend. Her current role is assistant to the bishop in pastoral care, which includes providing pastoral counseling, support, and guidance to pastors and priests throughout the diocese. She also serves on the priest personnel board and seminary admissions committee for the diocese. Mary has a master's degree in pastoral theology and is a spiritual director. 5 years ago, she learned that a very close family member was abused as a child by a parish priest. And this, she says, added a new dimension to her ministry. We're so glad that you're here. Thank you, Mary.
Thank you.
We are also joined today by Jim Richter. Jim lives in Grafton, Wisconsin. He is a medical doctor, a pathologist with expertise in breast cancer and gynecologic cancers. He grew up in a devout Catholic family on the south side of Chicago, where he experienced sexual abuse as a teenager. Motivated by these experiences, Jim eventually became a grassroots organizer in the survivor community, and he has contributed to multiple Archdiocese initiated survivor activities in Chicago and St. Paul, Minneapolis. For many years, Jim has participated in an annual Q&A presentation for men training to become priests at the St. Paul Seminary. And this allows seminarians to learn about his journey as a survivor. We're honored to welcome you, Jim. So let's begin our conversation. It will be moderated today by Christian Crocus, volunteer member of Awake's Courageous Conversation team and a theology and religious studies professor at the University of Scranton in Pennsylvania. Christian?
Thanks, Erin. Good afternoon, everybody. At least it's afternoon here in Scranton, Pennsylvania. And welcome and thank you to our speakers for being here. Thank you, everybody who's attending, for being here today for this important and courageous conversation. So it's good to be with you. My job is simply to put the questions out there and let our speakers talk to us and talk to each other. And I'm going to follow the order for my first question of the introductions that Erin just gave us. So I'm going to start with Father Tom. And in her introduction, Father Tom, Erin mentioned that you and some colleagues wrote a white paper, which is really a set of proposals for thinking about what seminarians ought to be learning and what benchmarks they ought to be meeting in terms of being prepared to minister, pastor, or be pastorally present to survivors of abuse in and outside the church. So I wondered, before you even get to the content, the details of that paper, could you just tell us a little bit about how you came to write it, where the impetus came from, how this project landed with you?
Sure, happy to. We have to go back to 2021, September 2021. There was here at Notre Dame, there was a national consultation on restorative justice and the clergy sexual abuse crisis. So it brought together about 30 experts from around the country for 2 days to discuss especially how the practices of restorative justice might be adapted and applied to our accompaniment of survivors of abuse in the church. One of the outcomes, one of the very specific requests that came through survivors, they're represented by the survivors who were at that meeting, was to offer something to seminarians. Could we not come up with a set of benchmarks to somehow propose to seminaries kind of a path for integrating trauma-informed pastoral care into the formation that they're receiving? And I think to just about everybody on the webinar today, that would make sense, because what is often has been lacking historically has been an understanding of trauma. And even sometimes the persons with the best of intentions, if we don't have an understanding of trauma in our pastoral care, and especially if we're trying to accompany survivors of particularly sexual abuse and specifically clergy abuse, well, we're probably going to be making a number of mistakes. So this was a specific request. And so with two other colleagues, we were pleased to kind of take the ball there and run with it. And we were able to put together a series of 12 competencies that the first 5 of which would be applicable in ministry to victims of sexual abuse generally. And then the last 7 were applicable especially to victims of clergy sexual abuse specifically. And in that process of kind of developing these, formulating them, we actually received direct input from survivors. So this was very much a survivor-driven kind of initiative. That's where it began.
Great, thanks very much. Yeah, that's helpful, and it's striking to know that it's responsive to survivor questions, survivor interest. Maybe this would be a good time. I think we're going to provide a link for anybody who's interested in reading the full white paper, which I've read closely, and I think it is worth reading the whole thing if someone has the time. But in case they don't, maybe you could walk us through quickly those 12 competencies, and I believe somebody's going to be able to put up a slide so that we don't have to remember every word exactly.
I think that's right, and we don't have to remember every single word. I'm just going to move through the slides kind of quickly. That's what the white paper looks like, and it is rather extensive. But if we just move on to the next slide, these are the first set of 5, and I'm just gonna, again, many of them are commonsensical in a sense, and I'll just kind of move through them quickly. Number 1, so again, these are competencies that we would hope that seminaries would check for and try to deliver, so that at the end of seminary formation, prior to ordination, most of our men could, kind of say, yeah, they have acquired some degree, some exposure, some experience that gives them a bit of comfort, at least in each of these areas of competence. So first, to be familiar with legal definitions of sexual harassment, sexual assault, and consent. Second, to understand the dynamics of power, where that intersects with emotional, physical, sexual, or spiritual abuse. Third, to demonstrate an understanding of trauma-informed pastoral care. Fourth, to be familiar with and comfortable sharing in small groups with victims. And 5, to be able to manage their own emotional discomfort and distress in doing that. Every one of those came through the suggestion of survivors. This is at times what they've been missing as priests in particular have tried to minister to them. If we go to the next slide, we have the specific competencies that we outlined in ministering to victims of clergy sexual abuse. To understand the distinction between clerical child sexual abuse and clerical adult sexual abuse. To understand the local diocesan policies regarding child and vulnerable adult protection. To be ready to meet with victims, to listen to their stories and validate their experience. To know how to receive and minister to victim survivors in the sacrament of penance. It's been one of my joys as a priest to be able to minister to survivors who in many ways have ached for a long time to return to the sacrament of penance, especially to those who tragically experienced abuse in that context. We go into some detail here about just how a priest can make that possible and should be ready to adapt and make that possible for a survivor. To be ready to be present at activities aimed at the healing of survivors and be familiar with the practices of restorative justice. To know the process taken when a priest is accused and how to best accompany him. We're interested here in justice for all involved, including perpetrators who've been accused. And to have a theologically sound understanding of the Church's theology of scandal. That's a final point that we make. So that's, in a nutshell, those are the proposals. And again, I think we've gotten a good response from a number of seminaries, but I just want to stress that this is just one small part of, and a good example, I would think, of what can be done to help us during these years of formation to equip men who are better suited to respond more adequately with greater compassion, with empathy, with deeper charity, to the needs of victims of abuse that they encounter and that they minister to, especially with that understanding of trauma and understanding the dynamics of trauma.
Thanks very much. I think I can imagine that maybe somebody attending might have a follow-up question, which they can put in the chat box toward Catherine if they wanted to ask about one or other of those benchmarks. But that's I think a good summary and overview of the paper. And I wondered, Father Tom, last thing, if you could just say a word. You just mentioned that this is one piece of many that we in the Church have to consider. But someone might wonder sort of what the status of a white paper is. Is it more to hopefully generate more conversation among Catholics in the United States around what sort of training seminarians should have, or do we expect particular seminaries actually to consider these benchmarks? Could you just say a little bit about that?
Sure. Yeah, its primary purpose is precisely to generate not just kind of pie in the sky conversation, but actual conversation about how can we implement this. And I know that many seminaries have received it and are actively, thinking. I'm grateful. I do very much sense, given how the whole discourse around trauma-informed care has emerged, I think there's very much a sense in seminaries that yes, we very much need this in our pastoral ministry courses. So I think there is a lot of impetus right now to do that. But bigger picture, obviously, this just being one piece, a lot of, especially over the past, 25 years, certainly since 2002 at least, there's obviously been a greater attention to the screening of seminarians, and especially to helping our men get healthy in seminary, so that the desired outcome. It's not a cliche. It's, the desired outcome are happy, healthy, holy priests. And unfortunately, a lot of the abuse that has happened in the church is a result of unhealthy men being ordained. So I think a lot of our work has been aimed in that direction. But I think this new focus on trauma-informed pastoral care really emphasizes the pastoral piece and how we're receiving, walking with, and accompanying victims. And I think this can be a huge help going forward.
Thank you for your work, and thank you for sharing it today. And maybe that's a good transition, I think, to Mary, to ask Mary a question. Mary, we heard a little bit about your background, both as a victim assistance coordinator and now as a special assistant to the bishop in your diocese. And if I understand correctly, you haven't worked directly with seminarians, but I'm presuming, or we're presuming, that you've had lots of experience working with priests in dioceses over those decades of service. And so I'm wondering if you have, through your observations, through your interactions with priests, healthy and unhealthy, have you a sense of what you would hope a seminarian would get in his training before he's ordained a priest?
Sure. Thank you for the question. I actually do each summer work with our seminarians to treat with our director of Hispanic Ministries, and we offer what's called a Chrysostom project that really talks about pastoral care and human formation very directly for our seminarians throughout the diocese. But looking at Father Tom's benchmarks, the thing that strikes me most is the benchmark about their own discomfort and awareness of themselves, because to me, that's a very basic beginning place, especially when we come to ministering and providing care for people who have been deeply wounded, for them to be aware of their own. My experience is I need to say we've come a long way in 20 years. The fact that Father Tom and others have spent, well, that Awake exists. It's amazing the work that has been done to get to a place to acknowledge the deep wounding. And I think we'll talk a little later about how the wounding continues. But the tendency is too often, my experience with our priests has been to spiritualize the pain and to talk about how we can kind of pray it away. But I think because of work that has been done by many people in the church, there's just a realization that a man has to be aware of himself, what his own wounds are, and then how to get help for that or to get guidance. And I'm sure Father Tom can speak to this, but self-awareness is key, so that they can really enter in to a relationship with someone and know what it means to walk alongside as opposed to resolve something. But that probably is the thing that I think is the basic that I think we need to keep stressing in seminary is the human formation, and not human formation out there with somebody else, but their own. So they know what are their own triggers, what are the things that they're really uncomfortable with. And that is so important. I say to our young men frequently, important to know where you're not comfortable. Don't go there, get help, right? Or get guidance. So it's really just a deep deep awareness. And I do see great progress in that.
Thanks, Mary. Yeah, I appreciate that note of hope. I'm wondering, though, if you don't mind, you mentioned along your answer something about the ways that wounding continues. And, I know in our pre-meeting conversation, we talked a little bit about the fact that some Catholics may bring an attitude of, well, things are better now, this problem is in the past, and that itself can be a source of continuing to wound. And I wondered if you could reflect on that a little bit for us.
Sure. The pain of this is multi-generational. And the tendency in any pain in the human experience is to trying to figure out how not to be in pain, right? And one of the ways to do that is either to deny it or ignore it. And we've done all of those things in the church along the way. So I think those of us who've been involved, what we've learned from victim survivors and the graciousness of their sharing is that we have to keep speaking to the experience, even though it changes. And I frequently remind our priests, just in general, that a victim survivor may not be in the pew on any given Sunday, but their parents and grandparents and siblings and friends are there. And so to remember that when they're homilizing, remember that when they're providing pastoral care, that this deep, deep wound is not done. Again, we've come a long way and we've learned a lot about healing and trauma. But the role of the church, and especially those of us who serve in the church, and especially our clergy, need to have an understanding that the church needs to find a way to inhabit this suffering with the people they're serving, like to be with them in it. And that's a battle, to be perfectly honest. I'm on a committee with Father Tom on restorative justice, and we have trouble sometimes getting petitions at intercessions during a mass. So we have a lot of work to do, but we have a passion to do it. I mean, for the care of the people. And the young men, we have to remember that many of the young men that we are ordaining now were not born when any of this became was an awareness. And they aren't experienced, and we're placing them in parishes to be pastors very young. At least they are in our diocese. I think that's not uncommon. So how do we help them? And the responsibility is ours to make sure that they have what they need to be able to be with people, like to really be with them.
Mary, one technical point, in case somebody who's attending today doesn't know, when you say we've had trouble even getting mass,
Yeah,
could you say a little bit about what a petition is and what you're
sure. So in the liturgy of the Catholic Church, there's a period of time of prayer where we offer petitions just generally, and they can be very specific about the state of the world or for someone in particular. So part of the work in victim assistance work and just in safeguarding has been an effort to keep this wound in the awareness, and most importantly, in the prayer of the people of the church, and to ask our pastors to specifically pray for those who've been harmed by abuse.
Okay.
And that's where we often can hear, well, that's over, right? And so our role is to say, no, it is not over. This wounding is not over.
And at the end of every one of these courageous conversations, we ask our attendees to think about, and we ask you too to suggest, but concrete, practical takeaways. And so maybe this is one area some folks might already start thinking about. Thank you. Yeah. We turn now to Jim. Jim, thanks for being with us. And we're aware from Aaron's introduction that you've spent a lot of time as an invited speaker in seminary context, and especially, if I understand correctly, especially in St. Paul, Minneapolis, and as a survivor yourself. And I wonder if you could start just by giving us a sense of what those conversations are like. I know that's too general, but if you could just say a little bit about what those conversations are like, what you're hearing from seminarians, what kinds of questions they have, and also when you go into that space, what are you hoping the young men or older men would take away from their meeting with you?
Yeah, thank you, Christian. Well, first of all, I'd like to just call out Father Tom number 2. I really like the power dynamic. I really appreciate that being there on that list of 12. And Mary, you mentioned some advice or some guidance around essentially kind of know thyself for the seminarians, and just be aware of your comfort level. And I would say that those two things factor prominently in my comments. So thank you for the introduction, and especially thank you for doing the more regular work and the consistent work of that formation. And so, Christian, my role in this is as an occasional interloper or storyteller, or sometimes changemaker. And so over the last now almost a decade, I have participated in a day of formation with the seminarians at the St. Paul Seminary in St. Paul, Minnesota, as part of a kind of 2 or 3 hour conversation and experience. That has over the years evolved from being either presented in the syllabus as earlier in formation, maybe in their 2nd year, or sometimes it's in their 4th year. The details have changed, but the format is essentially the same. I am invited on behalf of the formation team in conjunction with folks who are part of the Safe Environment team at the Archdiocese of St. Paul in Minneapolis. So this is very much a coordinated effort. And I have done this both as a solo presenter as well as a co-presenter with a very good friend of mine, really kind of storytelling to the seminarians, first-person account of abuse. This is not easy either to share or to receive. So let me just first acknowledge that the folks in the room, all of us, need to kind of approach this with a kind of a vulnerability as well as a shared understanding. There are times when this has been to an audience of 10 or 12. Other years, it is a much larger audience. And so again, both the participation in terms of active listening from the seminarians, their leadership, including the formation director in the room, and then at least 1, sometimes 2 or 3 members of the Archdiocese who oftentimes have already had some safe environment and boundary and some other kind of conversations around code of conduct with the seminarians. So this is not, if you will, a cold topic. And so that's how we kind of set ourselves up. And by way of introduction, we share names and affiliations, just as we did today. Thanks again for the warm welcome where folks are from. And then it evolves into, again, oftentimes a storytelling that really comes in 2 parts. The first part is my narrative, that is my experience. And the second part is really hopefully an exchange of questions, comments, and observations. And I would just say that typically there's a short break in between those 2, which has proved, I think, to be a source of great relief for everybody to just kind of leave the room for a few minutes and then come back and kind of re-engage with one another. You asked as well, kind of in terms of kind of the impact. So that's the format, really. And the impact really is an opportunity for a group of human beings who perhaps historically have not spent time around one another to really just have an initial introduction. And one comment that I make every year to the seminarians is, you have engaged with and talked with folks just like me in the course of your short seminary career, whether you know it or not. It just so happens today that you know it, you have a face, you have a story. But as I assure them, I am not the only one, and this will not be a singular experience at all. So my observations to them are assume that all are traumatized. We can come back to that in a moment, but just assume that all human beings are traumatized who come to you. And secondly, make no assumptions, either about your own abilities or the woundedness or the damage that folks kind of come to you with. I think that's a way, again, just to simply level set as human beings. And again, I just want to reiterate how much I appreciate Mary having shared that in her comments. And again, to Father Tom, the wisdom of really appreciating that kind of power or historical power dynamic, and how important it is for a man in formation to understand the implicit power they have in that role.
Yeah, thank you, Jim. That's really good. Especially I'm taking away that the insight or the admonishment to make no assumptions. That's important. If I could just push you a little bit on one point, I wonder if are there any questions or topics that seem to come up over and over again in the Q&A part of your sessions, or maybe something, I don't know, maybe something has surprised you or something that you've learned about where some of these guys are at, or I don't know.
Yeah. I've been surprised at the warmth and the openness at which these conversations have occurred. It is unfair, in my book anyway, to presume that these are not productive and open and candid exchanges. They really have been. In fact, over the course of 10 years, and although I'm no longer full-time in Minneapolis, St. Paul, I can tell you that I still have crossed paths with a couple of familiar faces. And those folks have come up and said, "Oh, Jim, I remember when," or "You may not remember me, but you spoke to my class." I take that as, again, just a nice litmus test that we are kind of doing something right, or at least that annual interaction with them is generally a very positive one. There are two questions that often come up, both of which are really challenging for me to answer. But I'll share those with you, again, not with an answer, but by way of kind of common denominator. The first is, what is the impact on your Catholicism, or what is your relationship with the church? That is a very, very difficult question, particularly in some seasons for me to answer. But I really appreciate the fact that they want to bring their role as a shepherd even into the moment. I appreciate that very much. Another question that often comes up, and I would say that this is probably the most common, is, what do you think we should know, right? Or put another way, and Mary alluded to this, right? If someone kind of comes up to me and shares this, like, what should I do? And I do that's a much easier question for me, at least, to answer almost every time, which is to listen and be present. It is also helpful, as has been suggested, and as Aaron did at the top of our start here, to simply acknowledge the harm and to share a sentiment of apology or sorrow. You're not owning it, as I say to the men. You're not taking any blame or any credit. You don't need to own somebody else's experience. In fact, I advise them to simply stay in your lane. And if your lane in that moment is to be another human being that is seen as being trustworthy and safe, then just be a trustworthy and safe human. And that doesn't require saying or responding in any particular way. I also invite them to trust their instincts. And I do think that part of formation is, if you will, kind of learning the ropes. And as Mary said, these men need to have a sense of who they are, and they need to be able to show up, if you will, as a whole person. But in that moment, right, you don't need to do any of those things. Simply be present to the human being in front of you, and again, kind of go with your instinct. And again, hopefully, as I say to them, if we've had this initial conversation, right, hopefully there is something about the interaction that we have had that you can take with you in that moment, should you feel uncomfortable, should you feel uncertain, should you feel fearful, right? Again, it goes back to make no assumptions and just assume all are traumatized.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. That's really good. I wonder, Jim, I'm going to ask you one more thing. Again, making no assumptions. I can imagine, let's say, that it could be quite scary for a survivor to walk into a seminary and to meet with seminarians, or to walk into any kind of an institutional Catholic space and speak. And so I'm not saying that's your experience. I don't know, but I wonder whether you have reflected on how do I want to put this? I could imagine that given that everyone's trauma, everyone's experienced trauma, you could re-experience trauma as a survivor in that space, or one could. Would you have any reflections or advice about how a survivor might exercise self-care? Were they invited to speak to their church group or to speak to a seminary or something like that? Is my question making sense?
Absolutely.
Okay, thanks.
So all of us, or rather, it is my primary responsibility to take care of myself and to take care of my emotional well-being. It does take, as some in this audience know, a degree of, as they say in some cultures, chutzpah, in other cultures, boldness or confidence to be able to bring oneself just to be in the room. So I'd like to first just acknowledge that it's not easy. There is a moment every year at which I need to pause, even though I've told the story many, many, many times. I need to collect myself. I need to give myself a little bit of grace before I continue. That's an authentic emotional reaction. I just need to acknowledge that. So I do think that that one needs to be prepared, and I do prepare myself, just as I prepared myself in the time before I joined you today, because it's not easy to retell that story, or as you said, as you alluded, Christian, to kind of re-experience that trauma. That's the first thing. But the second thing that I try to remember is that, and again, I look in this audience and I am well familiar with some of the work that many of you have done on behalf of victim survivors. And I think to myself, if there are those who are willing to have those conversations, bring those topics, do that work on my behalf, then I need to show up. And I need to thank, and I need to acknowledge, and I also need to participate. And this is very much in my mind, Christian, a collaborative effort. It was such a pleasure some weeks ago for the four of us and some of the Awake staff to have a conversation about this, because it really is, it is a partnership. It is a kind of a community of support. And so I try to do what I can to be a part of that community, and again, also to show up as my authentic self. And as was alluded in my bio, I have spent the better part of 20 years encouraging and supporting other folks also to have their voice heard, and also to be at the proverbial table. Again, this is very much it is also a part of the healing, and I won't wax philosophical, but this is good for me too.
Well, thanks, Jim. Yeah, we appreciate it. Okay, I have another question, but I think what I'm going to do now is just open up a little bit and see if any one of our panelists has something they'd like to comment, or that they've heard, or a thought that's occurred to them, or if they want to ask each other a question. A little bit of time just for our panelists for a little crosstalk, if you'd like.
I'll jump in, Christian, and just kind of piggyback on what Jim was sharing. And Jim, thanks for that. You probably saw me nodding my head in vehement agreement with many of the things that you said. I'm just, as I was listening to Jim, I just wanted to share. I just had a wonderful experience of being able to offer an elective course here at Notre Dame for 7 students in the Master of Divinity program on the abuse crisis. And we set up the course in such a way that I had a guest speaker come in every week. And, the first thing strikes me now, of the 7, 5 were seminarians or Holy Cross seminarians. The thing that struck me was, first of all, not just because the MDiv program happens to be very credit heavy. So, I mean, they did have to make some effort to lean into this and take on another elective that they probably didn't have a whole lot of bandwidth for. But more than that, it was overcoming the internal resistance. It really took them a lot of work to lean into this and do this. And I was constantly just congratulating them for it, because as Mary was alluding to, they had to get beyond the kind of ignoring, denying, spiritualizing or intellectualizing the crisis to actually do the work and be present. And the absolute game changer, and this is where I connect with Jim, was when I was able to actually have them connect personally in some cases or via Zoom with actual survivors of abuse. And that was the absolute game changer. And this was, it just, to a person in the room, they all, at the end, they said, yes, this was very, very hard, but we wish this were like a 3-credit course and that every one in the program were required to do it, because it really got them to a place where, yeah, they weren't inclined to intellectualize or spiritualize it. It was becoming very real. And I think also giving them a sense of security, like, okay, this is hard, but we can do this. And it really was, what also was apparent to me was this was coming out of a place of their own sense of vulnerability. And I think this is something that participants today should also realize that's happening in seminaries. 2018 was a real wake-up call for most seminarians. So 2018, in the revelations of Theodore McCarrick, this was just, especially for those who were just beginning formation at the time, who today would still be fairly recently ordained priests, this was such such a punch in the gut. It was such a there was such a level of just outrage and disgust at how this could happen. I think that really left a mark. But the thing that really happened was that a lot of these men were suddenly very acutely aware of their own vulnerability as seminarians. And I think that put them on just a very, very different footing to kind of go forward and understand this. And that goes hand in hand too with a dynamic that, probably not a lot of participants today would be aware, but in seminary today, it's just very common for men to be working with a licensed therapist, to be working through their own trauma. And really, so I think fortunately, we're getting further and further away from trying to do human formation kind of on a whiteboard, or human formation through PowerPoints. It's really coming down to human formation very much in the real, in themselves, and actually learning vulnerability and learning pastoral care from actually dealing with their own traumas and trying to get healed and trying to get well while in formation. And I hope that would be a bit of good news, because I do think that also sets these men up to be much more receptive, much more understanding from the inside of persons who've experienced trauma and have had to work through it.
Thank you, Tom. Yeah. Mary, has anything occurred to you?
Yeah, just very briefly, I think, for me, it all gets down to relationship and how we inhabit these relationships. What's our role? Who are we to be in these? How are we invited in? And to remember, and I think it's as important in the formation to help anyone who serves in the church, but definitely our seminarians and priests, that we are not responsible. Jim touched on this. We did not cause the harm. As individuals, we did not cause that harm. But to see the invitation to walk with people and to be with them as privilege. There certainly were days in the last 20 years it didn't feel that way to me. And certainly when I have family that were abused, it didn't feel that way to me. But it calls us, to go much deeper in our relationship with who we are, with ourselves, with God, and to really, really trust in grace and what that means and how it is articulated in these very difficult relationships, that there will be discomfort and great pain. And it is a privilege to be invited to be there. As difficult as it is a privilege to be there.
And Jim, any follow-up?
I would add that I hope that it's a shared privilege, and also, Mary, to your point, right? Again, these are I think carefully orchestrated experiences. Again, as any survivor participating event should be, it comes there are many in this audience who are familiar and who work in the restorative justice. These are conversations that can be very casual, but these are not intentional events or focused efforts, right, that are taken lightly. Father Tom, I really appreciate your use of the words spiritualization and intellectualization, or intellectualizing the problem. You may have heard in part of my introduction, I spent a lot of years in school. I'm not the brightest bulb on the tree, but I have spent many, many decades being an intellectual person. And that actually got me quite far, got me into my 30s before things could no longer be intellectualized. And I had a real awakening. To be clear, it was an unpleasant, nearly career-ending awakening, but it was nonetheless an awakening. And what I took away from that was that as challenging as it sometimes is, that being with my emotional self was much more important than any other, again, kind of coping mechanism that I could have. And maybe Christian, that is something that comes through in the actual multi-hour conversation with seminarians. Because there isn't any spiritual or theological or intellectual real content. It's just kind of a human story. And I think that as I have really come to appreciate, is a great connector of humans.
Thank you. Yeah. Okay, I have one more question, but I just looked at some of the audience questions, and it sort of dovetails with theirs. So I'm gonna lift up an audience question now, and anybody who wants to jump in first can jump in, and then what we'll do is we'll see if either of the other two of you want to follow up in some way. So the question has to do, we're focused on seminarians here today. The question is about forming lay leaders in the church. I know it's not exactly what you're here to talk about, but we wondered whether you've thought about the differences or the similarities, what the overlap would be, what the distinctions would be between, let's say, in a parish, forming a seminarian versus forming somebody who's doing pastoral ministry in a lay capacity. Does anybody feel called to answer that first?
Right off the top of my head, for someone in seminary or someone who wears a collar, to understand immediately the power differential that's just assumed, I have young men who are wearing collars, and they're early on in their formation, and people are asking them all these deep, theological and pastoral questions just because they're wearing a collar. They're making assumptions. How unfair to them, right? But I think that's a very important part of the formation for seminarians. And in terms of the lay formation, to help, my experience is helping them to understand that these men that they work with and serve with are men, and they need healthy, happy relationships with lay people to support them. And because what they carry is heavy. It's heavy. Yeah.
That's interesting. So in a way, I hear the distinction, but also saying that ordained and lay need to be in relationship with each other in order to understand each other's roles. And
Yes, definitely. Yes.
yeah, yeah,
And to appreciate the differences, right?
right.
Of who we can be in this journey. Yeah.
Right. Thank you. Yeah.
I really appreciate the question. And what occurs to me is just to say, just the very concept of formation of laypersons. I mean, I guess in some context we've been talking about that for a long time, but it seems to me that today, if we can really think about that in similar terms with which we approach the preparation of men for priesthood, in very similar ways, I think lay persons who are gearing up to a life of ministry in the church have to, for example, have to be very much engaged in their own inner work, dealing with, in a very similar way, dealing with their own trauma and learning what that means, because it's not just future priests who are going to be engaged in trauma-informed pastoral care. So are lay individuals, persons who are gearing up, like some students I had in my MDiv class who are gearing up for a life of service to the church, will also need to equip themselves with an understanding of trauma-informed pastoral care, and certainly would go about that best by engaging in some of their own work, taking advantage of a wonderful network of, especially of Catholic therapists that we have today, and really kind of doing that work from the inside to understand it better. Formation, again, it can't just remain at the level of PowerPoints. It's human formations has to go inside. Lay persons who are engaging for a life of ministry have to understand that they have that responsibility to engage in their own human formation, to be the best, to kind of prepare the best ground for the Holy Spirit to work on and minister to in the church.
Yeah. Thanks, Tom. Yeah, it's sort of reminds me of Mary's thinking about, well, even though I might not personally be responsible for your harm, I am responsible for doing the work of, if I'm going to serve in the church, of doing the work of preparing myself to be, as you're saying, trauma informed. So yeah, thank you for that. Jim, anything to add? No. Okay. Okay. Another question from the audience says, let's see. If there were and there may be, a priest or a seminarian today with us in this, joining in this conversation, or as you know, we record these and then make them available, so somebody may pick it up after today. And they may come to the realization that as a seminarian or a priest, an ordained person, or on the track to ordination, that they are lacking in the kind of knowledge and skills that we're talking about today for supporting survivors. Where would you direct someone? Let's say that his diocese is not inviting Jim Richter in to have a conversation with his class. How would you recommend a seminarian or a priest go about being better informed?
I would start.
Go ahead. Yeah, Tom, go ahead, please.
Yeah, just as I just did with my own students, because we were doing kind of an intensive course, and I, had the caveat, the proviso, just to say, look, this course isn't going to leave you fully capacitated to, to do this stuff. You have to go out and get it yourself. But thankfully today, I think there's just a plethora. One just has to look for them, but there's a plethora of workshops online workshops, in-person workshops, and so forth, that persons can, engage in and get that, get the trauma-informed piece kind of more in their hands and under their belts. So there are a growing number of resources available. We just have to, it's not really that difficult to go out and find them. So
Okay, thanks. Yeah, either Mary or Jim, anything to add to that?
Christian, I might just respond and say, welcome to the club.
Hmm.
You are in the same boat as many others are. So welcome to the boat. You're not alone. And also an invitation or again, a challenge to seek out those resources, that mentor, that connection, right, within their archdiocese or within their diocese. I would actually go a step further to say, and if you think having such a conversation as has been described is a good idea, then reach out and make that happen. So perhaps as part of your own development, right, you might want to advocate for something that maybe other people in your class are also thinking about or also concerned about, but aren't talking about. And as I suggested earlier, perhaps be that voice for someone else.
The only thing I would say is to not be afraid of not knowing something. I mean, when I said yes to being victim assistance coordinator, I had no idea what I was saying yes to, right? And so we learn our victim survivors, they move us and have moved us to just profound places of learning and knowing what it really means to care and to serve. And so if you don't know something, I think all of us have a responsibility to those who are in this ministry or part of this ministry to say it's okay that you don't know, and just to be able to be brave enough to say that.
Christian, may I make a comment?
Please.
Mary, to you and to the many others in this room and beyond who had no idea what you were signing up for, thank you. Thank you for, in the midst of the unknown, taking, I'm sure, what was an unbelievably challenging journey. But thank you for saying yes to a job that didn't have a job description, for which there were way too many unknowns, and it must have felt at times being all uphill. But had it not been for you and others who pioneered that space, I'm not sure that I would be here today having this conversation. So thank you.
Well, I'm sure I speak with Mary and Tom when I say, Jim, thank you for your courage and your witness and your friendship being here today.
Amen. Thank you.
And your reward, Jim, is that the next question goes to you first, which is from someone in the audience. Again, if a survivor in particular would feel moved, as you did, to do more in the way of participating in the education of pre-seminarians, but would not feel comfortable personally entering into that Catholic institutional space, would you have any advice for that person about how he or she may contribute in the way that you're hoping for?
Absolutely. So one thing that we're actually thinking about for the next event, which is going to be in March of 2026, the date typically gets set, is actually reading a letter to the audience from someone who is not in the room. So I, these out in the world, right? These can be called, kind of, victim statements. But I would just say that I certainly would be willing to do that. I do want to acknowledge that, as has been suggested by folks who understand the hierarchy of the church and have worked in it, Mary and Father Tom, that this is not necessarily the turning of a switch to make this happen. It does require, again, some conversation, some planning. The formation director, the Archdiocese, in the case of Minneapolis, St. Paul, Minneapolis, right? The Archbishop, who is incredibly supportive of this particular event, but again, of engagement with the seminary generally. And so I would say that there's, lots of ways and lots of work that has to be done to be able to kind of make it happen. But again, simplified for the person that doesn't want to be in the room, absolutely, we could consider taking that approach. Another approach, of course, would be to write a letter I realize now I'm suggesting a fair amount of writing. You could make it an email to your leadership, to your pastor, to your bishop, to your archbishop, encouraging. And feel free, by the way, to say, well, you know, I heard Jim Richter say, and feel free to drop my name or throw me under the bus, because there are other folks, not just myself, who are doing this work. And we'd be very very glad to help and to advocate with you for perhaps change that you would like to see in your community.
Thank you. Yeah, I know the question was primarily directed to Jim, but does Tom or Mary, do you have anything to add to what he said?
No.
Okay, then this next question is directed first to Father Tom, but again, welcome to have follow-up. So Father Tom, do you have any other okay, so recommended resources? We don't know exactly here what resources mean, but I'm thinking concrete things for teaching the competencies that you and your colleagues mention in the white paper. Like what might a professor or somebody in the seminary use? And then the follow-up to that, or the addendum, is perhaps even in a diocesan context versus a seminary context, if you find these skills are in need also among those already ordained. So what are there, do you have go-to resources that you're using, maybe in the class you taught or so?
Yeah, great question. I'll just be very brief on it. In one final section of the white paper, we briefly discussed, we threw out some ideas about how this might be implemented. I think we lean there on very much the creativity of the formation team and the actual possibilities of the seminary. So we really, but what we do explore, for example, would be probably the best fit for most seminaries is to minimally dedicate a workshop to this, or workshops to kind of work through, and then bring in persons. The key is to bring in persons who actually have training in trauma-informed care, to actually bring them into the seminary. A lot of times these are mental health professionals, persons who work in social work in those contexts, bringing them in to give specialized training. Optimally, you would have an entire semester-length course on this. So really take one of the 2 or 3 pastoral formation courses and turn them into a trauma-informed pastoral care course. And then we kind of explain how you could kind of build that course around the competencies. Those are just two thoughts. But I think that in reality, that's probably how this would become concretized in a seminary formation program.
Good, thanks. Yeah, Mary or Jim, anything to add to that?
Not in terms of seminary. I will say, though, that we realized in our diocese that none of our men have been formed in trauma-informed care, and so we've started a series of offering Trauma 101 several times a year and trying to make it as easy for our priests to come and participate in that. So in different dioceses, there might be opportunities for people to connect with that. Yeah.
Good.
And you know, in my professional life and in my volunteer life, I really try to emphasize as well the importance of trauma-informed care, you know, trauma, you know, qualified, you know, mental health, you know, professionals, and also to just level set that, again, there are lots of things that can be traumatic in one's life that fall into that. So again, sometimes it is helpful to just remember that this is a broad scope of life experiences, right? That takes it, if you will, away of it can take it away, or instead of focusing on child sexual abuse, which is particularly traumatic, right? But really just to make it a little bit more generalizable. That's what I heard, you know, kind of just shared, and that's kind of what I heard from Father Tom. And I think that's I think that makes it more approachable, if you will, particularly in areas or areas of the country or in seasons when there are things like, as occurred in 2018, right? You know, cases or stories that come to light that kind of, you know, shake us.
Thanks. And it occurs to me too, Father Tom, that you mentioned when you taught this course, you had the chance to teach this MDiv course to 7 students, 5 of them seminarians, that you brought visitors into the class on a weekly basis, and that many of those visitors were survivors themselves. And so we might be, I'm a professor, I immediately thought of books, but persons are really the resources. And so having that interaction with survivors seems like that's key.
Christian,
Yeah.
can I offer just very quickly too, that we also don't want to make it too complicated for people. Kindness and generosity go a long way. You know, people who've never had classes or specific formation in trauma, I've witnessed do great good just with who they are and how they receive people. And so just encouraging people in that, I think, is very important when we talk about formation. Jim mentioned earlier on about being his authentic self, and you know, that goes a long way when we're looking at people who are seeking healing, and to be heard.
Good. Thank you, Mary. Okay. I think we're at 110, 210, depending where you are in the world, something 10. I want to ask probably a final question, and it's for all three of you. And it's takes a little bit different angle. It's asking, how might you advise seminarians, priests, or other parish leaders to support non-survivors? So this is anybody in the congregation who may feel hurt, heartbroken, angry about abuse in the Catholic Church, but may not be a direct recipient of abuse themselves. How might you address them? And maybe we'll start with Mary, and then we'll go to Father Tom and then to Jim.
But number one is to remember our role is never to try and fix someone or to convince them of something. And so I would say what I just said, to simply to receive them and to make sure that they know that they matter, that what their concerns are matter, and that I'm there for them.
Thank you.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think if I were talking to priests or seminarians, number one, and Jim kind of alluded to this earlier too, just be aware that they're there. Okay, they are present when you're preaching on Sunday, when you're in church. First of all, persons who experience trauma, and I totally agree with, we should just assume that whoever this person I have in front of me has experienced trauma, but know that many parishioners are impacted in different ways. Persons who have, first of all, I think of the persons who are not there, right? Because they've been deeply scandalized by this. They've walked away. But persons who are there but still struggling, I think we need venues for them to first of all, to be able to talk about this. I remember how impactful it was, how many times I had people come up to me, maybe after a homily where I did address the crisis, and just to say, Father, it was just such a relief to actually hear you talk about it, right? To know that, to communicate that it's safe, not only safe to talk about this, but we would welcome that, that opportunity to dialogue about it, to create venues for that. And yes, and just be, again, as always, to be ready to hear persons who have suffered this secondary trauma, to be ready to receive their anger, whatever it might be. I think, it's a great question, and we can't forget how many persons there are in the church who are hurting, not because they've been directly abused, but they've had family members who have been sexually abused. By the way, we can't forget also about those who are hurting in the church as a result of spiritual abuse, emotional abuse, psychological abuse, all the awful exercises of abuse of power. So I think we have to send a message that it's okay to speak about this.
Thanks.
Christian, I would second the notion of kind of acknowledging or simply talking and being as inclusive as possible, right? In acknowledging, what people are worried about or concerned about, or what they might be reading in the headlines, or again, just acknowledge kind of like, where folks are at. And again, to be unafraid, to be inclusive of calling out specific, concerns or specific worries. As a leader, I kind of taking it from kind of from a pulpit standpoint. So again, just speak about what folks are talking about. And I have shared this anecdote before. There have been periods of time over the last 2 or 3 decades when I have wondered. I wonder what those bishops talk about when they all go to a meeting, because I know what they're probably not talking about, but it seems to me that would be the one thing that should be on the agenda. So I guess, don't be an ostrich. And again, just acknowledge what is on the table for folks in their in their kind of in their, if you will, kind of day-to-day considerations. I don't think it requires anything heroic at all. It is simply acknowledgement, as Mary said, kindness and gentleness, an occasional inclusion in a petition, an occasional call out from the pulpit in one's homily, an occasional participation or creation of an event that acknowledges that there are victim survivors. These are, I would hope, relatively approachable and feasible ways for folks to show up on behalf of those who have been harmed.
Thanks, Jim. Yeah, and it brings me all the way back to Mary's comment about introducing petitions into the prayer of the church. That gives everyone a chance to acknowledge and to express something, at least together. Okay, well, I am about to turn things over to Catherine, but I want to thank Jim, Mary, and Father Tom for a very rich, honest conversation. I really hope that people will follow up with all the things that have been recommended in terms of reading, outreach, and so on. And it's really been a privilege to be the moderator in this conversation. So thank you very much. And now, Catherine, you take it from here.
Christian, and I'll begin with sincere thanks as well. Thank you so much to the three of you for sharing your expertise. I'll introduce myself briefly. My name is Catherine Hours, and I'm Awake's Community Engagement Specialist and part of our Courageous Conversations planning team. One intention of the Courageous Conversations series is to inspire personal action, and I'll invite our panelists back on screen in just a moment to share some closing thoughts about actions each of us might take. I do have a few announcements before that. Our next public event is going to be an Advent prayer service inspired by Our Lady of Guadalupe, and that will take place on Zoom on Wednesday, December 3rd at 7 p.m. Central Time, 8 p.m. Eastern. We'll follow up with an email where you can find more details and register. Our follow-up email will also include a feedback survey about today's event and include registration for part 2 of this Courageous Conversation, which will take place next week, Thursday, November 13th at 7 p.m. Central, 8 p.m. Eastern. It's a chance to break into small groups and discuss ideas that we heard today. I hope you'll consider joining us if you're available. Now we'll return to our panelists for some final thoughts. So question to each of you, what action steps would you suggest that our audience members take to support seminaries informing priests to respond to abuse survivors? Jim, maybe we begin with you.
Yeah, so use your voice. Acknowledging if you are a primary or secondary victim survivor, that is kind of part of your story, part of who you are. Acknowledging that to a man of the cloth can be very helpful. If you're not comfortable doing that, and that is absolutely okay, then certainly try to show up in other ways. Again, in very, very action-oriented ways. Again, perhaps you want to write a note, perhaps you want to send something anonymous. but just kind of, again, kind of acknowledge yourself, your experience, and give voice to that in order to make it tangible and real to folks who may just need a reminder of that.
Thank you so much. Mary, can we go to you next, please? What action steps you would suggest to audience members?
So I want to agree with Jim in that, use your voice for those of us who are in the church as lay people to encourage those of us who serve in the church, including our seminarians and our priests. Number one, treat them, love them, treat them with kindness and love them. Don't make them special. Help them to be human. And then encourage them to have, for all of us in the church who work in the church, to have a small measure of the courage that our victim survivors have had, and to support them in that.
That's beautiful. Thank you. Father Tom, can we end with you, please?
Sure. I can only second everything that Jim and Mary just said. Make your voice heard, share your story. Where there might be a sense that it is safe, I know that especially younger priests would be, especially those who are attuned to, who, as we often say, who get what's happening here, who have felt deeply shame for how church hierarchy has handled this, who have felt rage and anger for what survivors have suffered. If you have the sense that your parish priest might actually get this, might actually be open to being approached, if you feel that's safety there, to actually reach out and to try to form a relationship. So much of what we're trying to do in the church right now is about restoring right relationships, and that could be something really huge, to try to form a healthy relationship with a priest, and to be open to opportunities to do that. And of course, there is always prayer, praying for healing, praying for restoration of right relationships, praying for seminarians, praying for priests, praying for the healing of all victims in the church. So that's where I would direct people.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate all these insights. As we close, the leadership of Awake is motivated by our faith to do this work. And when we gather, we pray together. So we will end today with a short prayer, and we invite anyone who wishes to stay to join us for that prayer. We know that there are good reasons that some may not choose to stay for prayer. And if you'd like to sign off now, please know that we wish you peace and goodness, and we hope to see you again soon. Now, as we begin our closing prayer, let us remind ourselves that, as always, in the presence of God who is love. And feeling that presence now, we collect ourselves, knowing that listening is an act of love. Thank you, loving God, for bringing us together this afternoon and giving us the sacred gifts of community and the wisdom that we have heard today. May we hold each other in our hearts, each doing our part to cultivate love, hope, and healing that leaves no one out and no one behind as we continue to build this beloved community. Amen. Thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you. God bless you all.